Welcome to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Reverend Steve Andrews. Today we start the study of a new book, the book of Judges. After the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of Yahweh, "Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them?" Yahweh said, "Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand." And Judah said to Simeon his brother, "Come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites. And I likewise will go up with you into the territory allotted to you." So Simeon went with him. Then Judah went up, and Yahweh gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. They found Adoni-Bezek at Bezek, and fought against him, and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adoni-Bezek fled, but they pursued him, and caught him, and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. And they brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. And the men of Judah fought against Jerusalem, and captured it, and struck it with the edge of the sword, and set the city on fire. And afterward the men of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites, who lived in the hill country, in the Negev, in the lowland. And Judah went against the Canaanites, who lived in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron formerly was Kiriath Arba. And they defeated Sheshai, and Ahiman, and Talmai. From there they went against the inhabitants of Debir. The name of Debir was formerly Kiriath-Sepher. And Caleb said, "He who attacks Kiriath-Sepher and captures it, I will give him Achsah, my daughter, for a wife." And Othniel the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it, and he gave him Achsah his daughter for a wife. When she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field, and she dismounted from her donkey. And Caleb said to her, "What do you want?" She said to him, "Give me a blessing. Since you have set me in the land of the Negev, give me also springs of water." And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. And the descendant of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up with the people of Judah from the city of Palms into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the Negev near Arid. And they went and settled with the people. And Judah went with Simeon his brother, and they defeated the Canaanites who inhabited Zephath, and devoted it to destruction. So the name of the city was called Hormah. Judah also captured Gaza with its territory, and Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. And Yahweh was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country. But he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain, because they had chariots of iron. And Hebron was given to Caleb, as Moses had said, and he drove out from it the 3 sons of Anak. But the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem, so the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. The house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and Yahweh was with them. And the house of Joseph scouted out Bethel. Now the name of the city was formerly Luz. And the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, "Please show us the way into the city, and we will deal kindly with you." And he showed them the way into the city. And they struck the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and all his family go. And the man went to the land of the Hittites, and built a city, and called its name Luz. That is its name to this day. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth-shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Iblaam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, for the Canaanites persisted in dwelling in that land. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not drive them out completely. And Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, so the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, or the inhabitants of Nahalal, so the Canaanites lived among them, but became subject to forced labor. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or of Alab, or of Akzib, or of Helba, or of Aphik, or of Rehob. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites and the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth-Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth-Anath, so they lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth-Shemesh and of Beth-Anath became subject to forced labor for them. The Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the plain. The Amorites persisted in dwelling in Mount Heres, in Aijalon, and in Shaalbim, but the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. And the border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah, and upward. This is the word of the Lord. The book of Judges that we see and we started into today is going to cover the time span of around 1400 BC up until 1048 BC with the death of Samson, the final of the judges. And even though we don't see it yet today, we're going to see a cycle repeating itself through the book. Essentially, you've got a cycle of four things. So you could draw a circle, right, and put blanks at the top, the bottom, the left, and the right of the circle, and fill in those blanks with these words: sin, oppression, deliverer, peace. And this cycle is just going to keep repeating itself. The people of God sin against God. They rebel against him, and he gives them over to foreign oppression. And after a time in that oppression, they finally cry out to the Lord. They finally repent, and the Lord forgives them by sending them this deliverer, a judge. That's the meaning of the name of the book, not like a judge with a gavel in a courtroom that we think of today, but a judge as a military champion, a hero that would fight for them and deliver them. This is then why Israel and the disciples in the New Testament expected a military king, a champion that would deliver them from Rome, instead of who Christ came to actually be for them, to save them from sin, death, and the devil. Anyway, the judge would deliver them. He would give them a period of peace in the land of Israel again before the whole thing starts over, before they rebel, before they sin and get stuck back in oppression. We'll count as we go through the book how many times we see that cycle occur in the book of Judges alone. So it's going to cover a good 350 years of the history of God's people in between the time of Joshua and the time, basically, of the kings. Right after Samson's death will be the first king of Israel, King Saul. But again, our text today doesn't get that far. Our text today and tomorrow really is going to feel quite a bit like a brief summary of the book of Joshua itself. That Israel in the book of Joshua enters the promised land for the first time, and they go in to possess it, and they're going to fight, and they're going to take it. That's going to take somewhere between 5 to 7 years. It's a little difficult to tell for certain just how long, but it was 1406 when they went in, so calling this 1400 or calling this 1399, when you actually finally get to the period of the judges and the death of Joshua, that's the rough date to put on the book. Well, not date of authorship, but the date for the start of the book of it, at least. All right, so as we look then, after the death of Joshua is mentioned in the text, and it's a little strange, actually, that that's mentioned, because when we get to chapter 2 tomorrow, we will see the death of Joshua in chapter 2, right? So how this pattern plays out precisely, hard to say. They've already gone into the promised land. They've been doing some of this fighting. The giving over of Hebron to Caleb, that's going to happen during Joshua's time. So this book is going to be the book about what happens after Joshua. But again, a lot of this first chapter or two is going to be summary for us from before, for those that have been through the book of Joshua already. So first, who's going to fight the Canaanites? Who's going to go up first? And Yahweh selects the people of Judah. They're not firstborn, right? Reuben was the firstborn to Jacob, Israel. But Judah is the one that ultimately is given the firstborn, basically, blessing and birthright from his 12 sons. So Judah's the one selected to go first, for Yahweh has given the land into his hand. I saw notes that casting lots is a likely possibility for how this was done. The problem with that is Yahweh actually says words. It's not just that Yahweh selected something. So casting lots, almost like rolling dice to decide what would come next. It was trusted the Holy Spirit led that process. But here God actually says, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. So I would suggest that the Lord spoke to his servants, right, to teach them this, whether that's Joshua at this point, again, in the summaries context of things. So Judah doesn't want to go alone, calls on Simeon to go with. Now, when you see these names in this chapter, basically they're tribes, right? The tribe of Judah, the tribe of Simeon, but they're referred to as individuals. These are the 12 sons of Jacob, 12 sons of Israel that we're reading about today. So Judah goes up, Simeon goes with, and they conquer the Canaanites and the Perizzites. We learn that they defeat 10,000 of them at Bezek. Bezek means pebble, so likely referred to by that name as a kind of a mockery, an insult of how they were able to easily defeat them and destroy them. It's been reduced to pebbles. The king there is called Adonai, or Adoni Bezek. So Adon is the Hebrew word for Lord, so he is Lord of Bezek. He is the Lord of Pebbles. Again, sounds like a mocking title, as we see some of these other cities are named specifically for what has happened there, and that could be the case here as well. So he tried to flee the battle. They caught him. They cut off his big toe and his big thumbs. His thumbs and his big toes. This was a common practice in the ancient Near East that showed subjection, showed servitude, that one has been defeated, humiliated in the process. And the king himself is going to admit, we don't get his name, that he's done this to 70 others himself and that they lived under his table, so God is repaying him. Which is an interesting phrase. Is he referring to the actual God, Yahweh, or is he referring to whatever pagan deity that he himself worshipped? Can't say for certain. But the trouble here is, and this is one maybe to talk about with your children, it might be difficult if they're little, just because of the nature of the grotesqueness of the picture here, but if they're a little older, should Judah have done this? And again, by this, they took after the practices that were common for ancient Near Eastern kings to do this, to cut off and humiliate. Is that what they've actually been given to do? And that goes back into Joshua and also forward into the time of the kings, that they were not supposed to have done such a thing. They were to have actually wiped out completely, destroyed, and they left him alive. So that would not be good. Then you get to verse 8, and you see that they fight against Jerusalem, they capture it, but it would only be temporary, because as you get down to verse 21, Jerusalem is not in Judah's control. It's not in Judah's land. It's part of the land of Benjamin, and Benjamin is not able to conquer it. So we'll see that here shortly. So instead, they then go down, they continue on into the hill country, so they go southward. The Negev is the dry country, or the south land, south of what would normally be considered Israel to this day. And then we see a recap, actually. You can go to Joshua chapter 15, verses 13 through 19 to pick up what is verses 10 through 15 here in this text. So this is a familiar account of what has happened, that Hebron is going to be given to Caleb, one of the two faithful spies. Joshua had been the other one back in the time of Numbers 14 and going up to the Promised Land. Yes, it was Numbers 13 and 14. And Caleb, as he goes and prepares to conquer these various places, he offers his daughter as a wife to anyone who conquers Kiriath Sefer, a specific city, and his brother Othniel is going to be the one to accomplish that. Now, Othniel's name is one that you are not done seeing as we go through this book. He's actually going to be one of the judges in chapter 3 when we get to that point. So Caleb does that for Othniel, gives him a wife, and then being given land in the south country, the dry country of the Negev, she asks for springs of water to go with it, and her father obliges. Then we get to the Kenites, who are from Moses' father-in-law. Jethro is one of the names that he goes by in the scriptures. He did appear to have a couple of names as a priest of Midian. Anyway, he's a Kenite, and these are his people, and they're going to go with the people of Judah. And so they go down into the Negev against Arid, which would be 20 miles south from Hebron or so, and about 10 miles east of Beersheba. Beersheba often considered to be the southernmost point of Judah. So here you've got another similar city, a similar location for that city. They conquer also Zephath so thoroughly it's called Hormah, which is Hebrew for destruction. They capture Gaza, Ashkelon, Ekron. Those are Philistine cities on the Mediterranean Sea. The battles with the Philistines are going to be prominent in the books of Judges and also Samuel coming forward here. They take possession in the hill country, but we get that word finally in verse 19. He could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron. So there's a level of fear there the Judahites not comfortable fighting against, as if the Lord had fought for them, they would have been able to win such a battle with ease. All right, then we get to verse 20. Hebron given to Caleb. You can read about that in Numbers 14. That's Moses giving the promise. And Joshua 14, where it's actually more specified, where he beats the 3 sons of Anak, perhaps reference to giants there, again from the Numbers 13-14 section. But, again, a failure. Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites. The Jebusites have lived among them to this day. So the Jebusites are going to live in Jerusalem all the way up until the time of King David. That's almost 400 years later from here. It looks like it's maybe around 1002 BC that David will conquer the city of Jerusalem, which was called Jebus by many up until that point because the Jebusites lived there. Right? The connection of the old name, Jerusalem, is going to be a name given to it by the people of God. Joseph conquers Bethel. They spied it out first. We saw that in Joshua. Early on in Joshua, the spies going into Jericho first. Joseph practices that with Bethel. And they find a man, and they offer to let him and his family live if he will show them the city and how to get into the city. You might ask your children who that sounds familiar to. Who else helped the spies of God's people, and because they helped the spies, got to live when the battle came? And that would be Rahab from early in Joshua chapter 2, that Rahab is promised that security, that safety, that she got to become part of Israel and is one of the ancestors mentioned in the lineage of Jesus Christ when you come into the gospel account and the genealogy of Jesus. This man, having survived, goes off to the land of the Hittites, which would be up to the north, what we call Turkey today, and he builds a city there and gives it the old city name that he remembers from before. Bethel means house of God, so they changed the name of the city to reflect the worship of the Lord over time. That actually happened in Genesis already. Different story. All right, the rest of the text today is going to be about failures to do this. That Manasseh, Ephraim, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan, it's going to be 6 tribes there, failed to drive out certain peoples that they were supposed to because there's a lack of trust in the Lord. That's going to be a major emphasis then of that section. Some of these peoples they put into slave labor. Others simply lived among them, which either case means that the pagan worship practices of these people were much more likely than to influence the people of God because they didn't drive them out. They didn't get rid of these practices from the land. They would see the Canaanites worship. They would even be tempted to worship with them. And in many cases, they would. They would marry them. They would have families together, and they would become parts of these pagan cultures rather than remaining faithful to the Lord. So you can read about all of those different places. Lots of different cities and locations mentioned in that 10-verse section there. How you pronounce them, do your best. Many of those places we don't really know much about. Some of them are familiar names, but not all. When you get to the last part, verses 34 through 36, it appears that Dan never actually got the promised land allotted to them, like that portion that was separated out for Dan, because they didn't trust the Lord. And because they trusted in idols, they trusted in themselves, the Lord would not fight for them, they never get it. And ultimately they end up moving north. Instead of the land that was allotted for them, they're going to get a little bit of land up north at the northern edge of the kingdom. You can read about that by the end of the book. It's Judges chapter 18, so we'll get there in a couple of weeks. So that's our text as we open up the book of Judges.